Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Trade Surveillance and Data Capture for MiFID II Compliance, sponsored by Napatech. My name is Michael Shashua, and I'm the New York-based editor of Intelligent Trading Technology for the A-Team Group, and I'll be moderating this one-hour session on this topic. Today, we will look at how MiFID II requires firms to monitor trading activity in real time and reconstruct past trading events, as well as showing quote data to regulators. During this hour, we will examine MiFID II's demands for trading surveillance and capture, providers' technological response to data capture demands, how quote data is becoming a greater concern, and the added benefits that may come from trade surveillance and data capture updates. I'll now present our expert speakers today, who will introduce themselves, starting with William Garner.
Thank you for that. So yes, I'm William Garner. I'm a financial services partner at Charles Russell Speechley's law firm, specializing on advising, in particular, trading and markets related issues.
Thank you, William. And Clive Posselt.
Thank you, Michael. Clive Posselt. I'm the commercial director of Instrumentix. We are a flow monitoring company, and we specialize in providing granular data and insights across all asset classes to relevant trading counterparties.
Welcome, Clive. And Dan Joe Barry.
Hi, I'm Dan Joe Barry. I'm from Napatech. Napatech's a provider of packet capture technology and solutions. I myself am working in strategic marketing and opening new market opportunities for Napatech.
Welcome, Dan. If you would like to pose a question to any of our panelists, please submit them through the on-screen interface, and we will do our best to include them in the discussion. Today's event will be interactive, and we will have polls for you in our audience throughout the hour. But let's begin the discussion now with this question: what provisions of MiFID II and MAR, market abuse regulation, are relevant to investigating trading anomalies and capturing data about these anomalies? Let's start with William.
Thank you for that. I thought I'd just start with a brief overview from my side as to what I think happens to data and technology issues, in my opinion, in relation to MiFID II and MAR. And in my opinion, there seems to be a fundamental change in emphasis when it comes to MiFID II, which also sort of takes into account MAR, which obviously came into force last year. And combined with that, there seems to be a fundamental change in expectation by the regulators. And clearly with MiFID II, there are some fundamental changes in the directive itself, so some fundamental changes beyond what we saw with MiFID I. So for example, obviously there are a lot more instruments that are covered under MiFID II, so the obvious example being commodities. There are a lot more types of firms that are covered, so for example, now it's pretty much clear that all proprietary trading firms have to be regulated. There are obviously other issues like transparency requirements, which are now across the board for all instrument types. And obviously we have new types of trading venues. So for example, OTFs for instruments other than shares. So there are some fundamental changes in MiFID II in the directive itself. However, where the real changes come are in the details and what happens sort of in secondary legislation. So the level 2 and 3 texts. So the real changes in data and technology terms come in things like the regulations. So for example, MiFIR being the key regulation, in the regulatory technical standards, the ITS, and in the ESMA guidance and the ESMA Q&A. So when it comes to data, there are sort of three key issues that come out of MiFID II and MAR: data capture, data storage, and data accessibility and availability. And this is where obviously trade surveillance requirements merge between MiFID II and MAR. And with most regulation, when it comes to sort of being a regulated firm, when it comes to sort of the regulation of regulated firms, you end up looking at the nature and scale of the firm. So, for example, a sole trader will have very different requirements than a global investment bank. Having said that, the expectation across the piece by regulators and by the new changing regulatory environment is really links in with a change in general expectation in terms of firms across the board. So as the markets become more sophisticated, particularly in technological terms, so the expectation on the firms that are regulated become more complicated and more sophisticated. So, for example, in electronic trade surveillance, the expectation now is that pretty much every firm is required to have some kind of electronic trade surveillance in operation, as well as mere manual trade surveillance. And it's certainly for particular sort of firms in the market, for example, algorithmic trading firms, there are actual explicit requirements that they must have electronic surveillance techniques in play, and that's fairly obvious for those types of what are essentially technology firms. But there seem to be similar expectations across the board when it comes to trade surveillance. So for all firms operating in the market. So from my side, that's a sort of overview of where we are and an overview of the key changes coming out of MiFID II, which combines with the MAR requirements that came in last year.
Thanks, William. And Dan, could you perhaps illustrate a bit more of the context on data capture?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of requirements now in MiFID II and MAR for MiFID II in particular for capturing data and being able to show to the regulators that you've been performing according to the recommendations or to the regulations. So packet capture is an important part of that. The ability to be able to ensure that you've captured all the information that is relevant, whether that be voice over IP conversations or actual trades, and being able to ensure you've captured all that information and saved it for analysis. So packet capture is becoming now a fundamental capability that you have to have in your infrastructure in order to meet some of these compliances. And I'd like to hand over to Clive maybe to extrapolate on that and to say a bit more.
Sure. Bye.
Thanks very much, Danjo. I think as you're saying there, at the heart of these regulatory requirements, there's a need for clean, verified, easily accessible, and current and historical data. And in many places, this doesn't actually exist today because a lot of this data is held in different silos. Monitoring, tracking, and alerting, reporting this non-linear transaction data in real time is a huge challenge for firms using highly distributed platforms. And this is when it's coupled with often siloed technology teams, makes that level of granularity really quite difficult. So the ability to use packet capture to capture data across a distributed environment is becoming incredibly important. When you couple this with the RTS 25 timestamping regulations, and not just the ability to timestamp, but the ability to make sense of those timestamps in context of what the regulator is looking for, then packet capture and that type of technology is one of the only ways you're going to be able to do anything like this with scale.
Very good. Dan, could you help illustrate a little bit also about how this may play out through the entire value chain, as you've got the slide here to demonstrate?
Yeah, so this is actually a slide from the Boston Consulting Group, actually, and I think that many people kind of think that this is only an execution issue when it comes to MiFID II. But I think, as you can see in this slide here, MiFID II actually and MiFIR will actually affect a large part of the activities that are involved, all the way from research and pre-trade transparency all the way to GCA liquidity, benchmarking, analytics. So it's quite broad, and you can see the impact on some of these areas is quite large. So it definitely is something that has to be taken quite seriously. So you're looking at something now that stretches from pre-trade to execution to post-trade. And as I think that what Clive was just saying, you have a lot of systems today that are specific to different parts of these activities, with a siloed approach that's going from the bottom to the top. But having something that can go across all the different areas and be able to make your compliance surveillance and your compliance reporting a lot easier is something that's quite difficult today. And Klaus, you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in large organizations, typical business approach to this is technology teams frequently operate in silos, as we discussed. And the ability to bring together both connectivity specialists, infrastructure teams, trading technologists, traders and business managers, and the data that they all require to be able to bring together and to extract to make sure they comply with the regulation is extremely difficult, especially when you try to rebuild the life cycle of transactions. And really that typical way things look in a large organization stands in stark contrast to both the regulatory appetite, and also I think if you're looking for opportunities, the industry appetite to really use some of the regulation to drive business process and enhance business processing, which they may have not been able to do before.
And maybe, William, you'd like to comment on this as well, because I think you were trying to make that point that this is a broader scope than has been seen before with some of these regulations.
Yes, and the issue there, as I was alluding to, is MiFID I was fairly sort of broad brush, and as we all know, it was largely sort of share-driven, share-related. But even with shares, the number of sort of underlying level 1, level 2 techs was relatively light, and the sort of guidance provided back at the time was again fairly light. So the difference here is the enormous scope of information, the enormous scope of regulatory technical standards of guidance, and consequently of expectations on what firms should and should not be doing. It's enormously difficult to keep a handle on everything because you have to look at so many different sources in order to find out what the requirements and what the expectations are and what you as a firm need to be mindful of and need to do in order to maintain compliance. So it has become enormously more complicated.
Thanks, William. Dan, we have an audience question. I guess it's more of a clarification question. Is Napatech going more for VoIP, voice over IP capture, than HFT, I assume high frequency trading packets?
I think that the capability that we're bringing to the table is more generic. So the packet capture capabilities we have would look at all of the network traffic. So what we would ensure is that the basic raw traffic on the network is that we're capturing all of that and we're writing that to disk in real time to ensure we're not losing any bits of the data. So when you look at things at that level, which would be for the technical people out there an Ethernet level, then it wouldn't really matter whether it's voice over IP or whether it's trading information or anything else. If it's going over that wire, we're going to capture it, which is what makes packet capture quite interesting as a fundamental technology to have in your network, because it's not actually tied to any specific application. As we'll talk to in a moment, I mean, in this particular case, we can hand off to others who are going to do data harvesting and translation, and others again who are going to do aggregation, so that you can actually provide a complete solution. But it can be used for lots of things. So I wouldn't say that we're specifically looking at voice over IP or HFT. It's actually a generic capability that we think is essential in most networks going forward.
Thanks, Dan. And please continue to submit questions for our panelists, and we'll include them in the discussion. In keeping with that interactivity, let's go to our first poll question now, and we'll take about 30 seconds to vote on this. Are regulatory concerns affecting your firm's interest in network packet capture? And we've got about 10 or 15 more seconds to collect your votes, so please get those in. A majority say yes, they are affecting your interest in network packet capture. So from there, let's go now to our next discussion question. What is network packet capture, and how does it apply to compliance with MiFID II and MAR provisions and trading anomalies? Dan, and we'll start off, I guess, and hand over to Clive, and you'll collectively explain that.
Yeah, so packet capture is basically, as I just said, it's the ability to take all the information that's on your communications network, which in this case would be an internet-based, Ethernet-based communication network, and basically ensuring that you can take all the information off that and save it for further analysis. And the key thing there is that these networks are operating at quite high speeds. There's a lot of bits to look at, and the challenge is to be able to actually get that information without losing any of the bits and bytes that are there. So you're actually saving a copy of everything that's going on in real time. And that's essential because that will give you the basis then to be able to do some real-time monitoring and surveillance of what's going on, but also be able to do analysis after the fact and be able to allow other applications to get in there and do the analysis that they need to do. Now, as far as it applies to MiFID and MAR, maybe Clive, you'd like to take that point and explain how that translates then into some of the capabilities you need to have to address MiFID and MAR.
Absolutely, thanks, Dan. I think the one thing to point out, and I think William alluded to this earlier, is granular reporting, live monitoring and alerting with extreme pinpoint accuracy is non-negotiable, certainly under MiFID II. And where you have packet capture in place, as Danjo was talking about, you have a absolute accurate and effectively time-stamped record of exactly everything that's going through the network, be it orders, cancellations, fills, and decisions to trade, etc. So it gives you the data building blocks to harvest that granular data and then extrapolate that into real-time performance metrics, which flows into the RTS6, RTS7 demands around real-time alerting and monitoring of distributed trading platforms. So I think from an organization's ability to meet their requirements, accurate packet capture is really the underlying process that drives anything on top of that to make sure you're 100% accurate with your data, and then you can use it to make sure you're complying with the regulatory needs.
Dan and Clive, how does the role of encryption come into this with packet capture data? What's the challenges of encryption in relation to this?
Well, I guess from my point of view, the assumption would be that this would be performed within the organization. So I'm not aware to what extent there's a lot of encryption going on within the organization for what they need to do. I know that they do that outside of their networks. Now, when it comes to encryption, there are methods to do that, and as long as you're in the same organization, you have access to the keys, then there are solutions for being able to do decryption of these things and in relatively high speeds. But I think that comes down to the particular case. I don't know, Clive, are you familiar with a lot of installations where encryption is used internally in the environment?
What I am hearing under MiFID II is a number of the fields that need to be supplied by the buy side when entering orders, as in the name of the fund manager, the name of the trader, etc. People are looking to encrypt. Obviously, within the packet capture, there is processing of that via the sell side and brokers as you move through trading infrastructures to market. So on the sell side, in that instance, it's not important to be able to encrypt that because they're not meant to be looking at it. But as long as the buy side have their records to have the data tables to understand that and be able to supply that information along with the data provided by the sell side or captured by their own systems, then that should be enough to satisfy the regulators.
All right. This next question from our audience could probably go to all of our panelists, but William may have some insight on the legal aspect. And our questioner says, MiFID II is definitely putting a microscope on best execution. Many say that only those firms that provide best execution will survive. How important do you feel 100% packet capture is to the survival of firms under these new regulations?
Well, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, William.
Would you like me to sort of start off on that briefly?
Yes, please.
From my side, where you owe best execution, I mean, the real sort of key in legal and regulatory terms is how you demonstrate that you have got the best possible result for your client. And the challenges on that are that, you know, particularly where you have sort of voice broking, for example, the challenge is how you do that and how you gather enough information to demonstrate in the event that you end up having a challenge, or the regulator is in your office doing a spot check in terms of best execution. So what is vital is gathering information in relation to particular orders or trades and gathering evidence to demonstrate that you have got the best possible result in the circumstances. So doing that electronically, I think, is not strictly sort of required, as it were, but it certainly helps. And that's what I'd say from my side.
Dan or Clive?
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I think to extrapolate from what William was just saying, one of the key areas that are going to drive people's ability to survive in a post-MiFID world is something we're not really focusing specifically on here, but is unbundling. Because effectively, come January next year, the only result or reason for somebody to send an order to a sell-side organization is for best execution or the quality of their execution. So the one thing that all those players are going to need to focus on even more now is the quality of the performance they provide when execution for their customers. If we then take that back into the packet capture scenario and the ability to understand and have all the necessary accurate data, fundamental issue for everybody concerned is going to be make sure that their systems are operating at optimal performance to ensure that they're providing the best possible results for their customers, because the clients will vote with their feet. If they're finding they're getting better results from other people, there's no reason to send them order flow. And as William said, the tightness of the language is very clear, and the ability to have accurate data, be able to process that in real time, and also to look back historically to recreate market events, to use that data for testing of algorithms, testing of smart order routers, and troubleshooting is going to be absolutely invaluable.
I think also there's a good point here as well, Michael, in the sense that this is where perhaps the investment that's needed in MiFID II and all of these to actually meet all these provisions, at first instance might seem onerous, but actually is an opportunity, because these are things that could become a competitive advantage going forward. So having these capabilities in place might actually be an opportunity to get a lead on some of your competitors in doing this. So I think we have to keep that in mind also. It's not just doing this to satisfy regulators. Some of the installation of some of these required functionalities actually bring you some value that you can use in other contexts.
Thanks, Clive. Thanks again, Dan. So we can cover our ground today. Let's post our next poll question for our audience to weigh in on. Is your firm prepared to investigate trading anomalies in real time? And while you take just under a minute to vote on that, let me pose one question that came in directly for Dan regarding Napatech. They say policy enforcement servers like HPR, RiskBots, and Risk Manager already store orders and replay transactions for auditing. What is the Napatech advantage over such integrated solutions? Dan?
So I think we'll be getting onto this a little bit later, but the solution approach that we're talking about with our partners like Instrumentix, because I think that as Clive alluded to earlier, there is an approach today of having some more integrated solutions, which will do everything for you. So they'll do the actual capturing of the data, they'll do the transaction analysis, and do extractions, all of the reporting, etc. But they'll do it in a very siloed way, right? So it'll be for specific venues, specific asset class, etc. And so there will be solutions out there today already who are already doing some of these things that we're talking about. I think the approach that we're trying to suggest today is that there might be a way to rethink this, where you can combine, instead of looking at things in silos, you can start looking at them in layers. Maybe I don't want to get into that in too much detail yet, because we are going to come on to it. But certainly, what we're talking about is from a Napatech point of view, is the value of packet capture as a fundamental need, and how that will interplay with other solutions to be able to provide that end-to-end view that you need. But let's save that for a moment.
Thank you, Dan. And I think that you've seen that we closed out the poll, and the poll results, about 2/3 of you said you are not prepared to investigate these anomalies. Let's move on to talk about that a little bit. How must trading anomalies be investigated, and what is necessary to do so in real time as MiFID II demands? I think, William, you had some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, only briefly to say that this is an area where it's not necessarily overly prescriptive, i.e. it is not prescriptive about exactly what you have to do and the way that you do it. But the key change here is the emphasis on doing things both real time and post-trade, and as we were saying earlier, the other element to this is not just looking at trades, at executed trades, but also what's coming in with MiFID II is looking at orders and all of the circumstances surrounding a trade and how you get there, and the means by which you get there. So really, as everyone knows, the scope is widening enormously as to how you meet the standards and as to how you demonstrate that you are looking at anomalies real time is not quite so prescriptive, but clearly the expectation again is that you are doing this both electronically and that you have behind the scenes manual means as well. And the obligations are both with front office and with compliance departments. So, a massive widening of scope and mandate there.
Thanks, William. Clive?
Yeah, I think looking at anomalies, it's not completely prescriptive, but if you look at RTS 6 on algorithmic trading, there is a provision to make sure that you're monitoring your infrastructure and alerting in real time. And there is actually a section within that RTS that actually gives a description of what a production environment is, and that includes the applications, the hardware, the connectivity, and the telco network that stitches the whole thing together. So effectively, you had a very disparate group of technologies that something like packet capture allows you to assess in real time. You can look at orders coming through firewalls, the processing speed within algo routers and smart order routers. You can get full analysis coming back from exchanges, but at the same time, looking at that packet capture as it flows through the systems, you can also look at how the network provisioning is affecting the trading applications and their processing, whether there's bandwidth issues or you've got microburst alerts that you need to care about. So I think going back to that situation, it is somewhat loose in the language, but there is a demand to be able to understand across a distributed trading infrastructure exactly what's going on at any one time. And secondly, to be able to go back, if you're asked to, either on a compliance check by a regulator, to say exactly what went on through the life cycle of an order. And if we go back to the packet capture piece again, doing that with packet capture is accurate, it's scalable, where if you're trying to do this combining log scraping from order management systems with market data feeds, etc., that's not a scalable solution, and it certainly isn't something you can do in real time.
To elaborate on this a little bit, are T+1 checks going to still be acceptable, though?
You have that in MAR, and the vast majority of people doing trade surveillance checks are doing that on a T+1 basis. But I would argue that the direction of travel from regulation is moving more and more to live. Whereas in RTS 6, specifically on algorithmic trading, there is a specific demand for real-time performance monitoring and analysis and alerting.
Okay. Dan, did you also have any perspective to share?
No, I just to echo what Clive was saying, that if you do have packet capture as a fundamental capability in there, I mean, whether it is real-time or whether it's something that's done on a demand basis, you're covered, because the same connectivity data is available in real time, but it's also written to disk, so you can go back to that afterwards. So really, you have to obviously follow the RTS 6 and all of these things, but you can put an architecture together or put your solutions together so you can meet those demands as you see necessary.
Great. Let's move on to covering also surveillance and especially the capture requirements with our next poll question. Does your firm have a plan for deploying surveillance and capture technology in keeping with upcoming regulatory changes? So it'll take just about 15 more seconds to get your votes on that. And after we do, we appreciate we're getting a lot of questions in on this topics. And when we start the discussion, probably several of them will get answered in a matter of course. Let's close that poll. 60% yes. Okay. So, okay. So how are firms squaring the surveillance capture requirements after trades are complete and over multiple venues? Clive, could you kick off on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing you need to make sure is that the solution you're building is firstly asset class agnostic. Secondly, when you're looking at multiple venues, it is able to take the packet capture and then correlate complex one-to-many relationships between, for example, a single parent order being sliced through a smart order router and going out to multiple venues and capturing those fills and processing, so you can actually stitch the whole life cycle of that transaction together when you're needed to do so from a compliance perspective, or actually just looking at the performance of your own systems. The other thing really to think about is on a sort of trades complete perspective, is one of the things I think is very important, Danjo alluded to this earlier on, is where you need to start looking at other sources of information that need to be brought to bear in these types of instances. So, for example, if you're looking at trade and execution, you might want to be able to combine that with data from your settlement systems or your stock loan systems. You may want to be able to, for a surveillance or regulatory surveillance perspective, be able to correlate that back to login data into desktops for traders log into their applications, or gate data from the HR system to see if a trader is logged in or if he's not, or if somebody's potentially been sitting on their workstation to trade. So I think this is where we expand that idea from not just packet capture, but to be able to say, from a federated model, what other data sources are clearly important and how can they be brought back into the equation to actually provide more meaningful analysis and extrapolation of the data that's purely captured from the execution and the voice over IP systems. Dan, I know something you're keen to expand on as well.
Yeah, well, I think the key thing here is that, as we were saying earlier, there's a lot of solutions out there which are very specific to specific tasks that have to be done. If you look back on that Boston Consulting Group picture that we had there were a lot of different stages for pre-trade and execution and post-trade that this data goes through. And basically on each of those stages, there are dedicated systems doing something to analyze what's going on there and monitor and survey it. I think the key thing that's different now is that there's a requirement to actually do this across and be able to provide some sort of view across all of these different areas, which may not have been there before. So this is the new challenge that you have to face. It's how to adapt all of these systems so that you can actually get that end-to-end view, which leads into the solution approach of perhaps stop thinking in silos and start thinking more in layers about how you do stuff, with packet capture being a fundamental starting point.
Okay. Does every brokerage firm connected to the exchange, like a member of an exchange, have to have the real-time surveillance? Dan or Clive, or
William, perhaps?
William, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is yes. In short.
Also,
I mean, it goes across the. Sorry, I mean it goes across the piece.
Okay. Well, we also have another question about capturing unstructured communication for surveillance. What might be the legal responsibilities there? And that means.
Sorry, I missed the question.
What about unstructured communication, such as, well, voice, email, SharePoint, handwritten notes?
Yeah. Well, and I think, unfortunately, the obligation is to keep all of these things, and the scope has widened. So, for example, if you have a pre-negotiated transaction where you may have telephone calls between parties, where you may have Bloomberg instant messages and or email, and then you get communications into the exchange, if it then gets put through the exchange, what you have to have is you have to have records and details of all of that information, and the lawyers tend to see things sort of post-event. So we don't tend to sort of see what the requirements are in advance. So I can tell clients what the law and the regulation says, and in sort of broad terms what the requirements are. But we don't get prescriptive about how you meet those requirements. And where we tend to get involved is obviously where firms have sort of problems, as once. You've sort of hit a problem either raised by an exchange or by a national competent authority, for example. So since MAR came in, I've got a large number of market abuse related sort of queries coming in from clients, and we're already seeing some of the sort of the changes in sort of perception by the regulator and change of emphasis coming in already, and what the requirement there is that in pretty short order you have to collate all information in relation to a particular trading activity in question and provide it either to an exchange if that's relevant and or to a regulator. So I mean the requirement is to give all relevant information in relation to each transaction in question. So it's across the board, and that's going to be one of the challenges. Getting information about telephone calls, instant messages, emails, etc., and the requirement is to have all of that information.
I think this goes back a little bit to what I was saying a few minutes ago, in that it's all well and good to have your individual capture, but the ability to draw data out from other sources, being email systems, etc., and be able to build reports or screens, bringing all that back into a federated data model is potentially extremely important going forward with this scalability issue that people will have against this, because the ability to do that in effectively one pace allows you to have almost what is a virtual data warehouse for specific queries that you might need to, one, respond to regulatory requests or exchange requests, which William was alluding to, but also go back to customer requests around best execution as well.
Okay, very good. Let's now look at a follow-up on this, which is once surveillance and capture is sorted out if it is over multiple venues. What's necessary to then scale up the surveillance and capture technology to accommodate more volumes of information as inevitably is going to come in from quote data and the like? Let's start with Dan.
Yeah, so this is kind of goes back to that answer I gave to the person who asked the question earlier about how the Napatech approach is different. And so this is a good time to actually bring this picture on board and start talking about the way we're looking at the world, because you know, there's a lot of solutions out there that are vertically integrated and will provide a data capture and what we're calling a data harvest, which you could think of as something that extracts, let's say, trading information from the raw Ethernet traffic that we would be capturing, and they're also doing some aggregation of that on a silo basis. So there will be some sort of trade execution monitoring for a very specific asset or instrument or venue, and they'll do all those things in one box basically. Now these are not cheap boxes; they are expensive boxes. So, but what you're facing then is that as you look across the pre-trade, trade execution, and post-trade, and across assets and across instruments and across venues, you're going to have to duplicate these systems in all the places that you need to monitor, which, you know, as these are quite expensive, can be a very demanding proposition, to put it at least. So what we did together with our partners is sort of sit down and think, well, what if you could disaggregate this functionality and start sharing these capabilities between the layers? So we can certainly provide a data capture solution that can provide data in real time, or it can write it to disk for analysis after the fact. So that would be a nice fundamental start to that. So we have a layer that's ensuring that we're going to capture all the raw information, which isn't tied to a particular application. It's just looking at the Ethernet traffic. So everything is in there. So we're ensuring that we're capturing all of that. So once you have that in place, then you have the ability to actually share that information with multiple types of analysis applications, these data harvesting applications, which one example could be an application like Instrumentics, which is extracting that information and recreating the trading information that's been going over the wire and providing that for analysis. And then on top of that, again, you can have a data aggregation layer that's actually collecting all of that together and can actually even collect other sources of information like logs and other information from other systems and provide a holistic view of that. And that's a good example of that is some like Stream Financial, who we've been working with on that level. But what you have a capability here is you can now start to see how you can start scaling each layer independently. So you have data capture at the points where you need that with the capacities that you need at those points. But that doesn't necessarily have to say there's a one-to-one relationship between that and the software that's actually doing the data harvesting. You can also have different types of software that are actually accessing the same data capture information. So you can actually easily add new software for different types of harvesting that you want to do. And you can easily upgrade and replace that software if you're not satisfied with it. So there's a lot of flexibility that's now built into this model. So as the volumes increase, as demands increase, you have a way of scaling each one of these layers independently rather than having to duplicate very expensive boxes throughout your network. Maybe I'd like to hand over to Clive at this point to comment on that as well. I think you could offer a lot more insight into the harvesting and the aggregation layers here.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dandra. Yeah, the importance for the likes of us offering a flow monitoring solution is be able to grow with an organization or work with them as they see more and more data or more asset classes they're looking at coming into bear. As Dan Joe alluded to, the ability to scale is significantly important, but also we need to look at exactly what data you want to capture real time. You have the reportable transaction data that needs to be passed off to the regulators or the exchanges. And then you have the data that you want to keep for back testing and looking at improving your models. So it's really a matter of understanding the totality of the data. Do you need to keep absolutely every single piece? Or do you need to be able to look at parts of it real time and then have the written to disk data, be able to come back to at a later date and then forensically analyze issues when it comes to compliance and regulatory queries.
Thanks. And our audience was asking how many years you have to store and keep safe the trading data. I believe MiFID II especially increases it from as little as 6 months to now it's going to be 5 to 7 years. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but what does that kind of time frame, what demand does that place on making things, continuing to make things scalable?
So I mean, that's definitely, when you're looking at the Ethernet traffic there, I don't think there's a requirement in there, and maybe William will be able to clarify that, but I don't think there's a requirement there to actually keep all of the Ethernet traffic for 7 years.
Okay.
I think you can keep some of the trading information there, but maybe William, you can tell me I'm wrong there.
No, well, I think the base requirement, as you say, is 5 years, and national competent authorities can require you to keep it for longer. And I think that the requirement does relate to the services that you provide. So, in terms of capturing information about orders and or transactions, yes, I mean you do have to keep both. And yeah, I mean I think it's in Article 6 of MiFID.
So the key word there, I think, is information on orders. So if you think of a combination of what we're doing and Instrumentics, so we're capturing all of the Ethernet traffic on the network. Instrumentics then is making it's identifying the trading flows in that. So that's the actual trading information that's been extracted from the raw Ethernet that we're providing. So it could well be that that's the information that you need to keep, and then the other information can be kept for a period of time for analysis, for forensics, for addressing anomalies, for going deeper when you need to look at that data. So that's the way that we're looking at it at the moment. But maybe William, that would be an oversimplification.
No, well, I mean, the base requirements are set out in Articles 6 and 7 of the MiFID II directive text itself, and then obviously there are technical standards behind that, sort of filling out the details, as it were. But yes, I mean, the base requirement is the bottom of Article 7.
Yeah. Oh.
And that's in relation to data, in relation to services provided to clients.
Yeah, Clive, do you have an opinion on that one?
I think an example of that is you need your execution data, but if you're taking feeds from multiple venues on market data, which is going to run into an enormous amount of data, that's something that you wouldn't necessarily need to keep for that period of time. So there are, I think, as you alluded to, there are key pieces of data and important pieces of data to be able to look at regulatory requests coming in from the FCA, etc. But there are also massive streams of data that are very important to be able to monitor and alert on your real-time systems, but you wouldn't necessarily need to keep absolutely all of that for the 5-year or up to 7-year periods we've discussed already.
Yeah, I think that's a good example that you came with there, because I think this is where the strength of this approach really comes through, because by actually separating these layers, then you can have different requirements on each layer as to what needs to be kept and what needs to be handed on. So you certainly could have a longer time scale for keeping things that are relevant at the data harvesting layer, but have a shorter time scale for keeping things at the capture layer, because of the fact that maybe some of that stuff isn't relevant. So I think that's one of the ways in this architecture would scale a little bit differently to what you might see otherwise.
Exactly. As you're looking at a real-time trading environment, you'll be subscribed to multiple instruments coming in and data being provided through that. But I would suggest that the ones you really need to keep, or the ones that you do need to keep, are those instruments where you're actually carrying out transactions.
Thanks, gentlemen. one last audience question before we go on to cover our last discussion point. Well, we're posting our poll now on that, and as you vote, one of our panelists hopefully can address one-stop shop capture vehicles. What are technology vendors and regulators doing to provide or encourage these vehicles that they'll be able to provide all your information in one stop in one portal? Maybe Dan, you could lead off on that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand what a one-stop shop capture is, but if I assume what the person is alluding to, I think they're talking about a one provider of a dashboard where you could get your complete regulatory compliance overview. To be frank, I don't think there's anybody today that can offer that, because a lot of things have been focused on either a specific pre-trade or trade execution or post-trade action or venue or asset. So something that's out there today that can bring all this together in one system and one GUI does not exist to my knowledge, but I think Clive might be able to better to actually comment on that. But the key thing here is that with this solution approach that we're talking about here, there's the ability to actually provide that in a layered approach. So this is something that we're looking at and how to make that a possibility. So the end user will get the same experience, but maybe not with one system, one vendor. Clive, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I don't think there is one organization that is all things to all people when it comes to regulated data capture, data harvesting, analysis, and provision of one pane of glass to see the whole thing. But as we've talked about all the way through this, the ability to bring multiple partners together to deliver a federated solution that captures the data, analyzes it in real time, provides the alerting and performance, the ability to look back at historical data when needed, and then interact with other systems and bring that back into one place is something that we've been working on together. And I think that is the scalable way to effectively do this, because trying to build one appliance that does the whole thing, I personally don't think is practical, scalable, or even close to being affordable. Would you agree, Dan?
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Dan. And you see that you, in our audience, do believe that there are strong ancillary benefits. Let's get into discussing what some of those are.
Yeah, I think it's very encouraging that people can see that there is ancillary benefits with it, because we recently held a roundtable in London where William and Clive also were present. A number of different people joined us, and we're very happy that they did that. But it gave some great feedback on the day. And it was pretty clear that there was an opportunity to look at this as not just something that you would do to meet MiFID and MAR. You could certainly look at it that way and see it as a cost. But you could also see it as a way to make the improvements in your infrastructure that you maybe have longing to do, and to actually move your capabilities along so you can actually provide an even better service to your customers. So that's one of the things we looked at was earlier, was the ability to actually provide best practice execution and actually compete on that basis by showing with evidence that you are providing the best execution. But there's also other things, of course, that once you have a packet capture capability in place where you now have all the data that's going on in your network available to you in real time and on demand, then you can start to use some of that data for doing other types of surveillance. You can use it to do security, for example, which is going to be more and more important. So that information there can feed into other security solutions that you want to do. And the beauty of that is that instead of having security solutions that have to look at all the information all the time, it actually can go in and look at it on demand and see what happened on a needs basis, right? So there's some security forensics that you can do there. But there's also another aspect of business optimization involved in here as well. So the ability to actually use the information to improve your trading algorithms, for example, is one area that you can do. I think, Clive, you also have a number of other use cases and ideas about how this kind of infrastructure, once in place, can actually be used for a lot of other very interesting capabilities.
I would completely agree with you. Once you have the data in the format we're talking about, the ability to use that to drive business performance is huge. Being able to look at all your data across all your different venues, to be able to look at fill ratios across multiple venues through different periods of time or through market events. For example, you may be a sell side who doesn't have access as a member to certain markets, so you go through other brokers who are members. You may want to do analysis on them and say, actual fact, through non-farm payroll or through an ECB announcement, am I getting better or worse performance from those brokers? Should I not be using some of them? How do I rank them? Look at your gateways to exchanges at the moment. Is my A versus B running more quickly or running more slowly? Should I be flipping to the other gateway? How do I then look at enhancing my transaction cost analysis? Rather than just doing TCA versus my point of execution, why don't I say, actual fact, what was my slippage from the decision-making process of my smart order router deciding a certain tick in the market will mean I will fire out child orders to 3, 4, 5 venues, depending on the asset that you're trading, and to be able to understand the performance there. The other thing you can use this for is we've got the data captured, put it into backtesting, use that to backtest real life scenarios into your algorithms. How would your algorithms react on a normal day of the week versus a day where you've got specifically high volumes or market events going on? A lot of this sort of analysis has been really used by a very small part of the capital markets ecosystem to date, and these are people who have had large budgets or being able to build some of this, and it is a time-consuming process, some or a little bit of this themselves. But what I think some of this regulation is starting to do is democratize the use of data, the capture of data, and ensuring that everybody has the ability, via compliance, to be able to analyze and understand the vast amount of rich data they have within their trading systems to really drive performance for themselves if they're a proprietary trading form, or secondly, in an unbundled world, to make a real difference to their competitors when they're out competing for order flow from the buy side.
Thanks, Clive. And before we wrap up, if we can squeeze in one last discussion question, and that is, what's regulators' responsibility for archiving this data for how long? 5 or 7 years, possibly. William, maybe you have some insight on that?
That is an interesting question to which, unfortunately, I must confess I don't know the answer. Do you mean what the requirements are on the regulator to keep data that is given to them as part of this process? So, what are their obligations? Do you mean to keep data?
Yes. Yeah, that's what I think is being asked here. Yeah.
Well, as I say, unfortunately, I don't actually have the answer on that, on what the requirements are on the regulators. Apologies for that.
Okay, that's something that we'll find out. Okay, so thank you, William. I'd like to put you on the spot there. And
apologies for that. Yeah, I look at the requirements on firms. When it comes to what the regulators do and don't have to do is of less interest to me. I should know the answer, but I apologise, I don't.
That's okay. Okay, I think that we're out of time now, so I should wrap everything up. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Dan, Joe. Thank you, Clive, and thank you, William. I want to thank our audience for submitting so many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't quite get to all of them. We covered as many as we could, and we appreciate it. And to Napatech for sponsoring today's webinar. And now a reminder about A-Team Group's coming events. We have our RegTech Summit for Capital Markets being held in London on October 5th, and the similar program in New York on November 16th. All the information on that is at our website listed below. We have our next webinar on July 11th covering MiFID II and FRTB data analytics, benchmarks, and risk modeling. A-Team Group also has its handbook series with several titles from the past 2 years, most recently in 2017, Trading Regulations and MiFID II. You can find those at the Trading Technology Handbook section on our site. And thanks one more time to Dan, Joe Barry, Clive Passelt, and William Garner. Thanks to all of you who attended for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. And we please ask if you can take time to complete our post-webinar survey. It helps us in the planning to continue to keep these programs high quality and keep getting them better and better. We will notify you when a recording of this webinar is available, and we encourage you to share with your colleagues. Thank you again, and goodbye.